Well, welcome to our what promises to be a very interesting discussion between Denmark and Austria about climate policies. The discussion is going to be based on a presentation of our results from the recently released Economic Survey of Austria, which had one focus on sustainable policies, and Austria explicitly asked to be able to compare this with Denmark. So I will be very happy after the presentation to discuss this with the results with Torsten Hasford, who is the chief economist of, I'm not sure I would pronounce it right, Concito, so a green think tank from Denmark. Very welcome to the debate. Simon Elmauer Klambauer, who's from the Federal Ministry of Climate Action, will be here as a representative of the Austrian government. And Mark Sommer from WIFO Austria is a climate policy and energy policy expert from an Austrian think tank. So we will have a very knowledgeable group to have this discussion. Of course, you will be free to, the audience will be free to pose a question, ask questions in the chat. But now, without further ado, Sébastien Turbin, my colleague from Paris, he will show us some of the results from the report, and I'm looking forward to that intro. Sébastien, the screen is yours now.
Thank you. Can you just tell me if you're seeing the correct version, the correct screen? Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Nicolas, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And so thank you for inviting us to present the special chapter of the most recent Economic Survey of Austria, where, as Nicolas said, the special chapter looked at the main issues that Austria faces in its transition towards a green economy. Sorry. Okay, so as you probably all know, when we looked at the scene setting, Austria has set an ambitious schedule for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In particular, we have the net zero objective for 2040, a decade ahead of EU's targets. And before that, Austria will contribute to the reduction of 55% of emissions by 2030 in the European Union as part of the EU's nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. In the chart that we have on the slide, I think we have it on the survey as well, we followed this IMF convention, which shows not only the emissions target for sectors that are under the effort sharing regulation, which has a specific target for Austria, but also some kind of implicit target for total emissions. Although again, those objectives are set at the EU level. So what even today, if we see that the emissions in Austria have decoupled from economic growth, the current and the probably scheduled policies do not seem to be on track to achieve the targets. And the main challenges in containing the greenhouse gas emissions for the country have been the persistently high emissions from energy use in transport. That's the red line on the left, and the difficulties also in decarbonizing industrial processes, in particular for the production of steel and for the production of cement. So that's the dashed brown line. And here in the graph, it's the growth of emissions since 1990 by a sector. So for transport and buildings, you see that those emissions have been particularly dynamic relative to other OECD countries, which is the right chart. Even though then when you look on aggregate, emissions per capita overall are relatively low, or at least average compared to other OECD countries. So in addition, on the graph, what you see as well is that we showed emissions from energy use in buildings and emissions derived from the production of energy, which are key sectors, and here for all countries when it comes to mitigating carbon emissions. And so to address those issues and the reduction of emissions in the survey, we first consider horizontal policies such as carbon pricing and also support for investment and innovation. That go over, so I talk about horizontal policies because it goes across all sectors. I won't address them here for the sake of time. I will focus on sectoral policies, so the 4 sectors that are shown here. But I just want to mention, I think obviously for Austria, that to mention the eco-social tax reform, of which the OECD has been relatively supportive because it improves the quality of public finances by imposing a carbon tax and reducing maybe income and corporate taxation, and also through recycling through the carbon dividends, the climate bonus. What we say in the survey about the eco-social tax reform, though, is that the carbon price could be increased further, and also that maybe the distribution of the climate bonus could be better targeted. So now I would like to go sector by sector, and so I will start with the transport sector. So regarding transportation, what we emphasize is that there are still in Austria significant fiscal incentives for the use of cars, in particular the commuter allowance. And that's reflected in the large number of cars that you have in Austria compared to other OECD countries in particular. This drives the large share of emissions from transport in the country. And in the slides chart, what we show is that in addition to the incentives for car use, the overall tax burden difference between electric cars and cars with internal combustion engines is not as large as in other European countries. Sorry, I was continuing this. So in the end, what the OECD and the International Transport Forum at the OECD suggest is that greening transport emissions will require a three-pronged strategy. First, it requires avoiding unnecessary trips, in particular by incentivizing densification and through smart urban policies. And for instance, this could be done, what we mentioned in the survey, by expanding recurrent property taxation and making land use regulations more flexible. Then, after avoiding unnecessary trips, the second important thing is to shift transport towards active mobility and public transport. So this could be done by streamlining planning procedure for investment in walking and cycling infrastructure, by providing specific public transport services for underserved areas. In the survey, we mentioned in particular how to provide public transport in rural areas where typically public transport is less available. And also by reducing the fiscal incentives for car use, such as, again, those provided by the commuter allowance and other tax expenditures. And here, we relied a lot on, in particular, the work from WIFO that really provided a lot of details on those those brown tax expenditures related to car use. So avoiding unnecessary trips, shifting to a more active and modes of transport and public transport. And then, if you can't avoid traveling by cars, obviously, I think the one thing that everybody has in mind is shifting to electric cars. And so what we mentioned in the survey is maybe a smarter targeting of subsidies for electric vehicles, and greening the tax expenditure which promote commuting. And we discuss shortly the promotion of the standardization and the availability of the charging infrastructure. So that's for transport. So the second sector I want to focus on is the production of energy, and in particular the production of electricity. So the reason is that we can switch to electric cars, but at some point, if we want the electric cars to be green, we need the electricity to be green. And today, what we know is that Austria's production of energy is relatively decarbonized, thanks in particular to hydropower, but it's insufficient to cover energy demand. And in particular, we see that the imports of fossil fuels are quite significant because in the end, domestic energy production covers something like a bit less than 40% of total domestic energy supply, and has been it's been this share over the last 10 years. So I think it's clear that there's a substantial further increase in domestic renewable electricity generation, which is planned. But in the report, we suggest that it faces important constraints, and in particular, that planning and permitting procedures for installing renewable energy facilities can be burdensome. So in the graph, we have one indicator. So in Austria, what we saw is that wind power projects would typically take 5 or 6 years to permit, which is longer than most countries at least in Western and Central Europe. What we see that in Austria, I think as in a lot of other countries, efforts have been underway to accelerate those permitting procedures. through, for example, amendments to the Environmental Impact Assessment Act. But we think more could be done as usual. And for example, we mentioned the designation of specific areas where permitting procedures would be simplified for energy projects that are deemed of overriding public interest, and it's something that you've seen in at the EU done at the EU level as well. We also mentioned simplifying the expansion of the grid infrastructure and reducing the cost of connections. And finally, one thing that we mentioned also in passing is the supporting the greening of the energy used for the generation of district heating, which has a big place in Austria, in particular relative to other countries. And for example, we discuss increasing support for the deployment of large capacity heat pumps. That's for energy. The third sector that I wanted to discuss is the production of steel. As discussed, it's something which is kind of particular to Austria for specific reasons. So this green electricity, the green electricity that we just discussed, will be needed given that the industrial process to produce steel will change from those blast furnaces using coal or gas in particular to furnaces fueled by electricity. And what we see and what the graph shows here is that today the steel production, steel making in Austria relies on emission-intensive technologies. Although what we know also is that the single company that is responsible for 90% of Austria's steel production is changing one blast furnace by an electric furnace in each of its two main sites of steel production. What we know is that what we expect is that according to the International Energy Agency, the greening of steel production will most likely come from two main sources. First, through the use of natural gas and hydrogen to replace coal. In order to strip the oxygen from the iron ore, and then the resulting iron would be fed into the electric furnaces. And second, the second step would probably need carbon capture and storage, which can be relatively cheap and efficient for steel production because the emissions of carbon through the process are concentrated, and so it makes capturing carbon in particular more cheaper. And so, as a consequence, if we think about it, to support the decarbonization of steel production, we discussed reviewing the ban on the permanent geological storage of carbon, and setting a feasibility analysis of the storage capacity in Austria. And we also discussed the support of the development and deployment of new technologies through adequate innovation policies. In particular, the subsidies, innovation subsidies can support those technologies that are at the prototype or demonstration level. While instruments such as the market premia that Austria has for green investment, for example, or contracts for differences could provide also more certainty on carbon prices. And those instruments can be particularly well suited for the type of technologies that will matter for steel production. For example, hydrogen production, which are beyond the typical scope of R&D funding, but are not yet mature enough to be financed purely via the markets, even with a high carbon price. The last sector I want to discuss is the building sector. So reducing the emissions in commercial and residential buildings will be essential, as will be the last three sectors I mentioned. They represent 10% of total Austrian emissions, around 10%, and this is coming mostly from space and water heating in residential buildings. What we see and what we show in the graph is that Austria's emissions relative to buildings has been decreasing in recent years, but they're still relatively high compared to countries with similar quote unquote similar climate. And so buildings can be addressing building emission can be relatively tricky. So what we discuss is that to implement the right measures, so you have those particular challenges, in particular that the investments to green buildings, you have a high upfront costs of, let's say, for example, renovations and long-term benefits through efficiency gains. And also, one important thing in the building sector is the misaligned incentives, for instance, between owners in multiple ownership buildings or between landlords and renters. And for Austria, it's a particular issue given the large share of renters in the country compared to other OECD countries. Currently, so what we saw in the data is that the pace of renovation and the deployment of greener heating systems, such as heat pumps, was relatively slow in Austria. And so we discuss, what measures to implement, and we discuss a combination of regulatory and price measures to encourage the switching of heating systems to green alternatives and to encourage faster renovation. In particular, we talk about tighter requirements to be gradually set to change heat generators in buildings, and also to tighter requirements for renovations. And we discuss also the implementation of fiscal measures in a targeted way, in particular to fasten the deployment of those small scale heat pumps. And this particular issue of the split incentives between the landlords and the renters, we discuss what has been implemented in Germany, where the burden of the carbon price is borne more by the owner versus the renter in high emissions dwellings. Yes, sorry. So that's for this is a focus on carbon mitigation, but I wanted to end also because of recent events on the discussion of adaptation. And in the survey we discuss adaptation to flood risks. So we know that despite all the effort that we're going to make for carbon mitigation, the climate is going to change, and Austria we need to adapt. And in particular, what we talk about in the survey is that the incidence of floods, in particular, is likely to increase in the future, and the Austrian population is not only more exposed to the floods compared to other European countries, probably, and other OECD countries, but they're also more vulnerable given the low coverage of insurance. So those issues, again, have been illustrated by the recent events. And even if it can be hard to link climate change to single events, my understanding is that there was a recent work by the World Weather Attribution Group, which estimated that climate change had doubled the likelihood of the most recent floods in Austria, and also contributed to a 7% increase in their intensity. So in the survey, which was drafted before what happened this summer, we discussed how reducing exposure to flood risk will require better planning. In particular, we emphasize the importance of finalizing the soil strategy in order to progressively reduce land take. And it will also require support for adaptation investments, including through natural flood protection mechanisms and through just simple structural flood mitigation infrastructure. We also discuss how to incentivize those investments, you go through fiscal support, but we also think that just the provision of information about exposure, the risk that you're exposed to, would support investment by local governments and by households to make sure that they adapt to the risk exposure. And then we talk about reducing the vulnerability of households. So once the risk happen, how do we reduce the socioeconomic consequences of the flood? And so we discuss in particular expanding flood insurance through, again, information can be important for people to subscribe, but also having a more systematic approach by mandating comprehensive flood insurance in home insurance policies. So the objective of all of this is to have broad coverage at an affordable price and being able to cover large losses. And so what we see, the experiences from OECD countries, we often take the example of France. So what we often discuss is that achieving the three objectives could be achieved by mandating the inclusion of flood insurance as part of general housing insurance products, and provide public reinsurance for catastrophic losses. And so again, in France, for example, the private insurers must include insurance against flood risk in property insurance. And the coverage is funded by a fixed share of all premiums, And then insurers benefit from government-backed reinsurance through the CatNat system, which means natural catastrophe system in French. And so you have the state guarantee that ensures that the damages from the extreme events can be covered. So that's it for me. I will stop here, and I hope that has given you a broad overview of our survey, the special chapter of the survey. You can find a broader discussion of the Austrian economy in our survey, including, I think, a discussion of the macroeconomic outlook, and we've made some recommendations on fiscal policy if some of you are interested. And we discuss productivity issues, and we discuss issues related to inequalities of opportunity for specific groups. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Sébastien. This was indeed a good overview. And you also have very knowledgeable audience that already posed a lot of questions. Usually I bring in the panel right away, but I think here we'll do, I will take the opportunity to take up some of those questions that already came in and are addressed to you. So one is, do you have numbers of the, Erwin Meyer is asking, do you have numbers of the effective carbon prices in Austria over 20 to 30 years? And I think he's saying he thinks that those would be lower on transport and building than 10 to 20 years ago. But I don't know whether we have prices at that detail. And I know we do have prices, effective carbon price, but perhaps not over that time range, and perhaps not also at the sectoral level, but you know better than I do. So perhaps
we have it at a sectoral level, but it's true that for me, I don't have the on the long time horizon. I don't think so. I don't have it in mind. So this I wouldn't be able to say. I think it's probably true that usually I assume that the story is about tax expenditures and the fact that the tax expenditures incentivizing, particularly the use of cars, have increased. I assume that would be the mechanism driving this. I don't know.
And being, talking about transport, there was another more comment saying, oh, but there wasn't a word about public transport. So perhaps you can deliver
So
that now.
the main issue is that when we went on structural mission, we went to Vienna, where the public transport infrastructure is relatively good. No, so we talk about public transport and maybe not as much as would be desired. So we have, let's say the bad excuse is that we have space constraint in the survey. Well, I think what we emphasized on public transport was really the story of accessibility. It seemed that the main problem, my understanding was that the main problem was access to public transport in rural areas. So that's what I alluded to in my remarks. And so what we talk about in the survey is how to provide on-demand public transport, and examples that you've seen in other OECD countries. I actually don't know whether Denmark has something like this that I can propose, but we have a couple of examples, I think, of OECD countries that try to make sure that in rural areas you have access to those. You need specific types of public transport. Maybe it's not efficient to have like a standard bus line that has a standard schedule. So you need to adjust a bit how you develop public transport. And so we try to discuss those possibilities. Because again, I'm happy to if you have other ideas, but it seemed to me that this was the main issue for public transport in Austria, the inaccessibility of public transport in the rural areas.
Yeah, perfect. And I already see one hand raised from the audience, but I'll postpone this a little bit to later. Bear on me, because I want to bring in my panel now. And perhaps, Simon, I can start with you, because we're having this discussion, Denmark, Austria, and you're from the ministry that basically asked for that. You can just say a little bit what it is that interested you, particularly in Denmark, and why you thought that would be an interesting discussion to, well, shed a new light on the results that Sébastien just showed us.
Thanks so much, Nicola. Happy to come in on this. To be honest, it wasn't me who signed us up or volunteered us to be paired with Denmark, but I'm well aware that Denmark has a quite impressive track record on climate policy. Has had one for quite a while already, and is doing fairly well on per capita emissions. So I think there's plenty of room and opportunities to learn from an exchange. If I may, I'd also like to start by adding a bit of flesh and context to some of the main points raised and presented by Sébastien in his initial presentation, and also covered in the report. I would argue that the overall picture looks a bit better nowadays in Austria than the impression you might get, especially on emissions. I'd like to mention that they have significantly decreased, especially in recent years. So decoupled a lot from economic growth in 2022, when we had a decrease of more than 5%. There was an even larger decrease of emissions again in 2023, not yet covered in the report, of course, I guess, by around 6%. And the very preliminary first data to come out soon for 2024 hint at another decrease in emissions. So yeah, I would say the overall trend has been somewhat more positive in recent years. Nevertheless, of course, we are of course fully aware and committed that many more decisive measures will need to be taken in the coming years, and that's also why I think that this exchange and learning opportunity is very helpful. I think I'll leave it here for now, and happy to come in on specific sectors and with additional contexts at a later point.
Yeah, of course. And I think now that, thank you, Simon. Before I move to Denmark, I will ask Mark, who looks at Austria more from a think tank perspective, and is perhaps, well, easier for you, Mark, to comment a little bit on, well, you're waiting for a new government, right, to come in. So a new government always comes with new plans. And you as an energy and climate expert, what would be 2 or 3 things that you would really like the new Austrian government to do? So Sébastien focused a lot on the problems with planning procedures that make it more difficult to expand the grid and also bring in more renewables. Is that key for you, or are there other issues that have to be addressed first?
Well, there are 2 things. One is to not to stop the ongoing processes that are already unrolling. For instance, the very positive process in the electricity generation, where we already achieve, I suppose, 100% of our local demand by renewable sources. And also to foster the developments in regard to electricity in the transport system, so electric mobility. There we have a big chunk of emissions that we have to get rid of. There is a lot of work to do, and I think this is a central point in going to the net zero path.
So if I can build on that also with a question from the audience, or which came up on the public transport in rural areas, we didn't have so much flesh there. But would you say the electrification of individual transport is particularly important? And is that on a good path in terms of charging infrastructure, etc.? Or would you also say there's more of a need to provide more public transport, in particular in the rural areas? Mark, again.
Well, I'm not a complete expert on mobility, but as far as I know, there was some progress in the infrastructure of the electric mobility. And the public transport also improved, especially during the times of high fossil prices. There we saw a spike, but the public transport has limits and cannot change in that fast manner. Therefore, shift towards electric mobility would be more preferable. But of course, if this means large cars, about 2.5, 3 tons, to electrify that is not the right way, I think.
Yeah, and Thorsten, you from representing Denmark and thinking a lot about Denmark, but also in the European context and policies there. Simon already said you're something of a shining example in terms of climate policies. And the one aspect that Sebastian didn't show was, of course, effective carbon prices, which are much higher in Denmark than they are in Austria. And you told me before you a bit of a CO2 tax expert. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that. I think it has a long history in Nordic countries in particular, also in Denmark. So what has been done to ensure that even with a frosty climate, CO2 prices can be relatively high? What has that done to climate policies? So is that key, or are there also other factors that explain the Danish success story?
Thank you. Well, I'll try to keep it brief because, but I still feel I have to give a bit of context for Denmark, talking to you here today. Yeah, of course, we have a long history of focus on energy efficiency and historically relatively high prices on energy consumption, both for industry and for household consumers, dating back to the 70s. But if we look at a shorter time frame, what has been very decisive for current Danish climate policies is election in 2019, which was very much based on climate issues. And the government that came in had a very strong mandate to implement a climate law. So in 2020, we implemented a climate law, which set a 70% reduction target for 2030. And that climate law has been very defining for Danish politics. It was broadly based. It had the support of almost every party in the Danish parliament. And it's been a guiding principle. And it's often when you do climate policy, one of the major obstacles is, for instance, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Climate or the Ministry of Environment. They come to the Ministry of Finance and say, "Oh, we'd very much like to do these things." The Ministry of Finance goes, "How much is this going to cost?" But with a climate law and a target set to 70%, that was the kind of language that could also be understood by the Ministry of Finance. They are aware that they need to balance the books, but they are also very much aware that 70% was a legally binding goal for them. And that opened up many opportunities. And it's been very much a driving force, even though there's been a change of government during the period. It's been very much been a driving force of Danish politics, trying to get the necessary policy tools that will enable Denmark to get to a reduction of 70% in 2030. And along that line, there's been a couple of steps. And one of the steps has been imposing carbon tax on industry. That was decided in 2022. It's coming to law this year and will start taking effect from 2025. And of course, Danish industry is subject to the ETS, as is the rest of European industry. But this is a tax on top of the ETS, because looking into it, there was an acknowledgement that the ETS price wasn't strong enough, didn't give high enough signal. So there was an implementation of a tax on top, which is going to be phased in, moving towards 2030. The taxes put on ETS industries, of course, lower than those on industries outside the ETS. But in total, there's a tax in both. Following on from that, there's also been a long discussion, and we've reached the point this year where the government is currently in negotiations following what we call a tripartite agreement between the government and certain societal parties. So the Agricultural Association and the Industry Association, they got together. We were also a partner in this process, mostly as an observer, not as a direct negotiator. But they reached an agreement on also imposing a tax on agricultural emissions, all as part of achieving the 70% goal, which is, as I said, a very much guiding principle. So I'll start there, but if there are other questions,
we'll go into more detail. It's I'm envious, how we did a conversation years ago on Danish and German climate policies, and this broad societal consensus is really something very compelling, and one would hope that it can be established elsewhere. Yeah, Simon, perhaps you, because when I think of Austria, I also think about, it's a very, in some ways, a very corporatist country, right? With the associations representing almost everybody. And I think one of the secrets of Denmark is this law, but also this ability to carry climate policies forward from one government to the next, because there's a broad societal consensus, and also I think some strong institutions like the Climate Council and the Parliament reviewing progress on CO2 reductions regularly, and being able to intervene to ask for change, of course. So is that something that could happen in Austria too? So building this strong consensus, a long-term plan in order to reach these goals, or is it more a bit also a risk of a back and forth between different governments that follow each other?
Well, as you're probably all aware, we had our general election in September. So we have an outgoing government, and the negotiations for a new government being formed are ongoing. Yeah, I'm not in a position to comment on that, of course, as you'll understand. I can say a bit on carbon pricing, perhaps, as Torsten talked about the Danish example. I think on this, the situation in Austria is actually fairly stable and predictable. The incumbent government implemented a national carbon pricing mechanism covering the emissions, almost all emissions outside of ETS1, which entered into force in late 2022. It has an increasing path for the carbon price enshrined in law. So it started relatively low. We are currently at 45 euros per ton of CO2, and will have 55 euros next year. And then the ETS2 is likely to become effective in 2027. Is planned to become effective in 2027. And so I think that's like our thinking how things are going to evolve on carbon pricing in Austria. An interesting detail, perhaps, the implementing legislation for ETS2 already passed Parliament at the end of last year, and the scope of the national carbon pricing mechanism was kept alive and kind of moved forward into the ETS2 scheme, which, for example, means that emissions for the fuels in the agricultural sector will remain to be covered, or certain aspects in the transport sector which go beyond the European core and minimum. What we don't have yet in Austria is a national climate law. The incumbent government worked a lot on it. Hasn't happened so far. So for us, the EU-wide reduction targets, both in ETS 1 and 2 and in the effort sharing regulation, which is minus 48% for Austria by 2030, is very relevant. And the good news is, in the past 3 or 4 years, Austrian emissions were actually well below the targets in this effort sharing regulation, and below this decreasing path for emissions. So yeah, it should be the goal to continue on this trend, I'd say.
Very good. And Sebastian has raised his hand. I already also have a question for you, Sebastian. So Erwin Meyer again has pointed out that there's an OECD report also not only on the level of carbon pricing, which seems to be on a good path in Austria, according to what Simon says, but also the harmonization across sectors. So doing that would allow for gaining efficiencies, because of course you mitigate the least costly. You use the least costly mitigation options first. And he's asking, do we have knowledge about whether carbon prices are more or less harmonized in Denmark versus Austria? Can you comment on that? And if not,
on the comparison between Denmark and Austria specifically, no. I would need to have a look at the data. On the heterogeneity of carbon price, it's true, and I think we mentioned that actually and I'm sorry that we didn't have time to discuss maybe the carbon price in Austria relative to other countries in the presentation. The one point that we make also, not only we say that the carbon price could be increased and increase faster than scheduled in the eco-social tax reform, we also say that indeed there's the issue of heterogeneity, and in particular, we emphasize the fact that the effective carbon price for buildings emission is relatively low compared to other countries. And we make, I think this is a good point on heterogeneous carbon price across sectors, and that's where the OECD data on effective carbon rates is quite nice, because you have not only the effective carbon rate by sector, but also by fuel, and you can see this heterogeneity. It's evident, it's obvious, I think, in the building sector for Austria, and probably then you can have a look at it. Particularly interested remark from Torsten on the taxation of emissions derived from agriculture, because it's something that you see. It's something where you have a lot of difficulties in various countries, and it's really rare to have this coverage. So, and I wanted to rebound on carbon tax, actually on the level of the carbon tax. So it's nice to have this question, because also reacting to what Torsten mentioned about what Denmark has implemented in the top up on the ETS price. We mentioned actually I didn't know about Denmark. We mentioned the example of the Netherlands, which has also done this in particular, because that also provides so not only that means that you can increase the carbon price beyond the ETS price, and also there's it can allow to provide more certainty given the fluctuations that we see in the ETS by the weights, by the very way it's constructed. And that will, again, I guess the issue will arise again with DTS2 now for all the other sectors. The reason why I raised my hand, the last reason why I raised my hand, and again reacting to what Torsten mentioned, it's about this societal or the fact that it's a whole of society thing, and that there's this general agreement in Denmark. In the survey, I think you may have seen, and it's not only in the green transition, but for all the stories that we discuss, all the challenges in Austria, there's this particular challenge of fiscal federalism, or federalism in general. All the investments by sector that we mentioned, that in all the sectors I've discussed, and so in particular in buildings, also in transport, a lot of the investments will be undertaken by local governments. And again, it's not only about the green transition; it's also about education, infrastructure, and all those things. And here, we try to discuss all over the survey, and including the special chapter, how fiscal federalism could be adjusted to make sure that the incentives are there so that the investment are made. We discussed this for adaptation policies for the insurance system, also how we can make sure that the local governments that need to do the investment in infrastructure to adapt to, let's say, the increased risk of floods, how can we play also with those those incentives within the fiscal federalism system to make sure that those investments are made. And I don't know, I feel like for Austria, and even talking to everyone, we always had this issue about the fiscal federalism and the fact that it was a problem to coordinate investment. What we saw, I think, the new fiscal equalization agreement was really interesting in that sense, given this implementation of the future fund. I think so. It's around 1 billion euros, where you have now funding conditioned on some targets. So I think in the survey it arrived during the drafting of the survey. The survey we see it relatively favorably, although again it's not clear how binding those targets are, for example, and again it's really a small part of the funding through fiscal federalism. So it goes in the right direction for this dimension specifically, but for me I feel it's a really key issue for Austria, this coordination across local governments for green investments and for investments in general.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. And I think, from Mark, well, one thing, if you want to, I'd be interested in your reaction, because you're looking at energy systems, right? And if federalism is here sort of an issue, that would be, well, it would be interesting to hear if you see that too. But I also wanted to ask you about heating in particular. So we've looked at more at the energy efficiency of buildings. There was an interesting remark in the chat of somebody who said, well, it's not always efficient to focus on that. Sometimes you can just change the heating. I was always under the impression that you kind of need to do both. But perhaps you can comment on that. Where does Austria stand on electrifying heating, also increasing energy efficiency? And then I would like to discuss that with Torsten too, because I was surprised how seemingly not energy efficient Danish buildings were, but let's see. Mark, over to you. Muted, you have to unmute.
Hi. Yeah. I was a bit surprised that Austria is so energy inefficient regarding heating in comparison to other countries. I was not quite aware of that. But what I knew was that demand for heating energy is, where if you count out the heating degree days, is quite stable. It's decreasing slowly. So the energy demand per square meter is a very slow decreasing number, according to the Austrian statistics. Even though there was quite some effort the last 20 years to improve the thermal structure of the buildings. So the efficiency, there can only be a small progress seen. A strong progress we saw at exchanging heating systems, especially the last 2 years. There, the exchange for heating systems was subsidized strongly. This led to a strong exchange out of oil heating, which are quite substantial, and gas heating in the households, changing them for biomass and heat pumps. Heat pumps had a quite strong increase. So 60,000 units, that's about 1% of the total stock, has been changed to heating by heat pumps. So this was quite remarkable in comparison to the years before, where there was basically a standstill. Yes, that's on that. What was the first question regarding
federalism? Is that an issue in
federalism?
Terms of,
yes. Yeah, in many respects. One thing I had a look into was the urban sprawl. I had to look into the development of the Austrian urban sprawl in the last 20, 30 years. And I was quite astonished that that's not an issue in Denmark, that other countries are quite dense in comparison to Austria. And this is to some extent caused by federalism, because the urban planning is done by local governments, or at least the general plan is done by local governments, and the realization is done then by communities. And of course, there are different interests playing along, and this led to, over the last 50 years, led to a strong urban sprawl, decrease in density over all of Austria. And this, of course, makes it difficult to establish district heating, for instance. So this is not an option for the Austrian rural sites, because it's not dense enough. So it's not cost effective for many places, except for Vienna. And this is will be a great construction site. We have, I think, 600,000 gas burning heating system in Vienna. So to exchange them will be quite an effort. And heat pumps are not an option there because the electricity system in the buildings has to be exchanged. They are not strong enough. So district heating is the first to go option, and there's a lot to do there.
That's a good prompt because Thorsten, I wanted to ask you about district heating, and I do have Ewald Luger raising his hand. I will come to you, Mr. Luger. But Thorsten, I think Denmark is one of those Nordic success stories with a long history of district heating. So that seems to be working very well, and I assume you are pretty rural, right, beyond Copenhagen and some other big cities. So how is that working, and is there an important interplay with what you referred to when we discussed earlier, quite a strict land planning laws, which seems to have ensured that you don't have the same kind of urban sprawl that we are observing in Austria?
Yeah, I'll get back to that point. First, I'll just pick up a bit of what Sebastian was talking about. Because talking about federalism and financing and who are the actors in this process. And I've, at least initially, been blowing the Danish trumpet in terms of what we are doing so well. And there's no doubt about, in terms of climate mitigation, Denmark is definitely at the forefront. We, as a climate think tank, can of course see as we say, the holes in the cheese or the hair in the soup of what the Danish government does. But to a large degree, there's a lot of good being done in terms of climate mitigation. In terms of climate adaptation, Denmark is definitely not ahead of the curve. And that is, of course, where council decisions become much more important. Decentralized decisions, decentralized financing, because a lot of the financing related to mitigation isn't done decentralized. It's done actually by enabling policies from the central level that allow private actors to act. And part of the mitigation process is also, for instance, to do with financing in infrastructure, but a lot of the infrastructure is actually privately owned, not necessarily private shareholder owned, but private cooperatively owned. So many of these decisions are easy to take from a central point of view. That was just an aside, and I'm getting back to the district heating. First, you mentioned there was a graph of energy efficiency. Of course, that was a graph per capita, which had Denmark in the high end. And there's no doubt about it that if we measure energy efficiency per capita, we don't turn out very well. We did well historically, but what we have seen over the last effectively 30, 35 years is an increase in square meters per capita. It's a combination of wealth and desire to have bigger houses, means that there's been a rise of at least 15% in per square meters per citizen, just in that. And that is, given how long houses stand, that is quite a large rise. And if you have that, even though you're more energy efficient, it's very hard to keep your energy consumption down. So what we see effectively is a relatively flat development in terms of the energy consumption amongst households. So energy efficiency is constantly commenting with the desire and need for bigger houses. But that being said, the houses that are being built are given a relatively restrictive planning laws in Denmark, which means there's a very strict distinction between land areas and city areas. And when we're talking city areas can be defined as relatively small urban areas. But within those small urban areas, there's relatively large freedom to establish new housing developments, but there's relatively strict limits to taking in rural areas. And that's actually partially protective measures for agricultural land, because in competition with cities, agricultural land always loses. The willingness to pay for new houses is a lot larger than the value of agricultural land. So if there were no limits, at least that's from a Danish perspective, if there were no limits there, you'd see a relatively uncontrolled urban sprawl. And we are historically been very protective about not so much our nature, we don't have very much nature, but very much about our agricultural land and our ability to produce there. So that means there is very, very few houses being built in distinctly land areas. there's a lot of housing being built in rural areas, but always very concentrated around small urban conglomerations. And that, of course, makes it a lot easier to do centralized heating, roll that out. Today, it's around 50% of energy consumption, which is provided by centralized heating systems. And a lot of that is green, but mostly biomass. There's been a great transition. Of course, it's very easy to transition your heating system when you are doing a lot of it from a centralized place, because it's one investment decision instead of 2,000 or 5,000 investment decisions by individual households who have lots of other concerns. So it's a lot easier to move from today we're firing with gas, tomorrow we're firing with biomass, and tomorrow we are moving towards heat pumps. There's a relatively large transition now. The current transition, there was 10, 15 years ago, there's a relatively strong political signal to the heat producers. We wanted to transition from gas and coal over to biomass. In the meantime, there's been some kind of reconsideration of the values and the strength of biomass. So the newest signals coming from political point of view is to switch those heating towards electricity, large heat pumps. So the investments we see now in the heating sector are primarily focused on heat pumps, large heat pumps. Of course, outside those areas, we see people moving also towards individual heat pumps. Yes, I think that was most of your questions.
Yes, that was great. And I'm seeing Sebastian and Ewald Luger, but I do want to bring in you a little bit on this one, because it was so interesting and compelling, perhaps for the Austrian perspectives. I also have some comments that I wanted to bring in from the audience. So Simon, so this sounds very good, right? So land planning where you have even in smaller agglomerations or smaller towns, people living closer together, making it easier to have district heating. That's probably different in Austria. Bettina Hamann from the audience pointed out that, or she thought that building permissions are given out very easily in rural areas and square meters are already high. So Mark, you were asking why, you were surprised about the heat consumption, or it was the oil consumption for heating, I think. But what Thorsten said about square meters per person, that maybe play in Austria as well, I suppose. And she also says what is not considered enough is the building sector, emissions of the building sector itself, so cement, etc. So where do you see that? What would you like to see going forward in terms of decarbonizing the building sector, the heating, etc.? Is there more progress to be made in Austria?
Thank you, Nicola. I think the puzzle and the challenges have been summed up well in a way. There is the challenge regarding land use and planning regulation and building codes, where federalism plays an important role, and the subnational state and local levels of government play an important role. As Ministry of Climate Action, we very much welcomed the recommendation for a quantitative land use target integrated by OECD in the report. And our incumbent minister, has also been very outspoken to integrate such a target in the land use strategy being worked on between the federal and subnational levels in Austria. My understanding is that this has been a very challenging process. On energy efficiency and heating as such, I think we face similar issues in Austria with increasing square meters per capita. The share of single or double family homes is relatively high. There is urban sprawl, so that the density is not as high as it would be or should be or could be. And yeah, let me just mention or add to Mark on some of the programs from the federal government and our ministry implemented in recent years. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a real spike in the data looking back, especially on 2024 at some point in the future. At the moment, you get a subsidy of around 75% of the investment in Austria. If you change your heating system from fossil to climate friendly, so basically heat pumps and biomass, there is up to 100% funding or subsidy for the lower 30% of the income distribution. And so it's really like public billions being invested in the heating transition in recent years. But of course, the new government may also face challenges for fiscal consolidation. So let's see how this evolves in the near future. Yeah,
so you think households are rushing now to get that support because they don't know what will happen after? So that will be we'll look for that spike for sure, Simon. But so Sebastian had comments, but I made Ewald Luger wait for so long that Mr. Luger, I'm trying to unmute you now. It would be great if you could switch on your camera, and then you can talk. I have no idea what you're going to talk about, but let's see. I'm sure it's going to be interesting.
Okay. Hello, I'm Mr. Luger from FJ BLT Wieselburg. We're working on the one hand side with agricultural farm machinery, on the other hand side with boilers, biomass boilers and so on. What I want to, sorry for my camera is not working today, I do not know exactly why, but what I want to explain is the energy consumption in Austria. I think it's not completely comparable with all the other countries like Denmark or the Netherlands, Ireland, and so on, because the point is, typically we have to calculate in heating degrees days. That means all the days where the average time, temperature we have is less than 15 degrees, and this we summarize up. And there you will see, when you do this, that in Denmark or Ireland and so on, this summarized heating degree days are much more lower than in Austria. Mm-hmm. You can also, if you look at Austria is very popular for skiing. We have a lot of snow, so we have a lot of very cold winter days. We have a lot of high heating demand. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you look to the first slide that was presented, or one of the first, there you can see, for example, the residential and other sectors from 1919 to 2022. And there you can see that these energy demand, it was presented by our colleague Sebastian, it has been reduced by more than minus 40%. So maybe 2022 there was the beginning of Ukraine war. So maybe we are today around minus 50. Mm-hmm. And this cannot be seen. Also, I want to criticize that we are talking in energy consumption in tons of oil equivalent per capita. Mm-hmm. In Austria, we have, from the long tradition, we always use firewood, wood chips, wood pellets, and so on. So to calculate this biofuel in tons equivalent oil, it does not really be a good idea. We should split up this. What is this energy demand? How many of this demand is, for example, biomass? Mm-hmm. What is electricity? What is coal? I consider we have nearly no coal anymore. What is natural gas and what is heating oil. And
Well taken.
especially, yeah, it's especially in the last years, all new houses that are built today, on the one hand side, they use uh, most of them have photovoltaics, and they use the electricity for the heating pumps, air water systems usually, but also water systems. And the tradition of heating biomass heating district plants that go back 30 years. There was a big first step that communities with medium-sized district heating plants started. Also, some fired with, for example, straw. Straw from as agricultural byproduct of grain production, for example. So,
Okay.
and cereal production. That was a comment on this.
Very good. And very good comments, Mr. Luger. Thank you very much. And I think, Sebastian, you can already comment on the first one, because I do think we have adjusted, probably you haven't shown that, but we do have adjusted numbers for heating, right, in terms of heating days. So perhaps next time we can show those, but you also had some other comments, so looking forward to that.
So linked to linked to those buildings emissions. So to respond to what has just been said, I fully agree on the falling building emissions, and then probably yes, it's going to fall even more. At the beginning of the presentation, I said that I was going to focus on 4 sectors, and the first 2 sectors were industrial processes and the production of steel, and also the transport sector, because this is where Austria distinguishes itself from the OECD in terms of the dynamics, and that's where you see that emissions have not been reduced indeed since 1990, or the levels today are higher, at least for the latest data available. Maybe Simon can tell me that it's still okay in 2023, 2024. For buildings, and the reason why then we talk about buildings and then energy production. It's also here is indeed, it's not about the trend or that the trend is bad. The emissions are reduced, but it's a big part of emissions, and so again, it's 10% of emissions in Austria, and so that's why it seems that we need to discuss. And we can be maybe confident that emissions are going to keep reducing, but maybe we have reduced the emissions that were easy to do, and now we try to say, okay, you can do more. You can increase the carbon tax on buildings, which is relatively low, and we talk about all the challenges that every country faces in terms of renovations, in terms of changing heating systems. And I think last year in Austria it was a big debate about how do we set those efficiency requirements for heating systems, and that's a politically sensitive topic which will need to be addressed at some point. The heating degree days, indeed, as Nicolas said. So the graph that we have actually has on the x-axis heating degree days. So we try to compare Austria to countries where the number of heating degree days is similar. So you said the comment that we just made was that in Denmark the number of heating degree days is way lower than in Austria. That's not what we have in our data. So now it's more a problem of data construction. And to be honest, this is somewhere where I don't have the expertise. But so indeed, we try to compare, we say, okay, Austria's emissions are relatively high given its number of heating degree days. And so if I can finish on rebounding also on what Torsten had said. So I was looking at the floor area per person. Apparently in Denmark, it's one of at least in the data, I haven't seen really recent data, but it seems that in Denmark, it's huge compared to other European countries. Austria may be large, but more average. So this is something that's relatively new to me. That's interesting. More importantly, more seriously on district heating, I just wanted to, I think Torsten said everything. What we actually have in the survey, we talk about district heating. I think Simon Martin, mentioned the specific issues in Austria. I think it's the same where right now district heating relies a lot on biomass, but we're now have new thinking on biomass where assessing the carbon emission mitigation power of biomass is a bit tricky. And so we also more leaning toward large capacity heat pumps. And we have a box in the survey about the example of Denmark and the subsidy program that has been implemented, I think, in 2021 or something like this, to support the deployment of large-scale capacity heat pumps for district heating, which seems to have increased the deployment, to have worked. Now, I'll take a risk by having Thorsten on the call, who knows probably more about this than I do. But again, we have the example of Sweden, I think, really way earlier than everybody else on this, and then the example of Denmark more recently on how to fasten the deployment of large capacity heat pumps for district heating, which is a particular thing for Austria, given already that the district heating is a big part of energy consumption in buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. And we have 5 more minutes left. And I do have questions on, and the audience does too, on steel, electrifying steel production, and also adaptation. That would be nice to look into a little bit. So Mark, on steel, we heard that the biggest steel company in Austria is already moving towards green steel a little bit, but of course this is not yet at a competitive in terms of costs, and support is needed there. Sebastian was talking about the need for some carbon capture and storage, and perhaps the need also to explore whether that could be a possibility in Austria. Somebody in the audience said, well, no, it's not even needed. And so he said the H2 is the reduction material. I'm not very... So anyway, it would be interesting to hear. Do you think, so you pointed out that, Mark, that Austria made important progress with making its energy production sustainable. So will this energy production be enough to electrify steel production in Austria? Or will you need wind energy coming from Denmark? And will then the grid capacity in Germany be sufficient to bring it to you?
That's a good question. Thank you. Well, the just steel production, at the moment, the main source of energy and reduction material is coal or coke, and which makes around 10 to 12 million tons of emissions per year, which is quite a lot. It's the largest chunk of a single sector in the Austrian statistics. And the plan of this company is to replace the coal using hydrogen for that process. And to produce the hydrogen, electricity would be needed. And there are some estimates how much electricity would be needed. And the number that's running around is about a little bit more than 40 terawatt hours, also 43 terawatt hours. This is about a fifth or sixth of the Austrian actual production at the moment. So it's quite a bit. So there would be a much more windmills or photovoltaics necessary. But of course, you have to consider the peak load, you have to consider the stability of the connection, and so on and so forth. So the whole grid would be needed to be able to cope with that. And the question if the electricity could come from somewhere else. I'm not a real expert in electricity, but I had a look at the numbers of the trade between Austria and Germany in terms of terawatt hours or gigawatt hours. And I've seen that the total volume of import plus export between those two countries is about 18 to 20 terawatt hours. So it's half of that what the steel company would need. So just looking at those numbers, it's not so realistic that this will happen. So either it's a combination from several parts, from domestic production and an increase of imports. But at the moment, the grid, I think, cannot cope with that.
Thorsten,
and just to carbon capture and storage, I cannot comment.
Okay.
Also, I have no expertise.
Yeah. It's a complicated issue. Thorsten, what do you think? Can you produce enough offshore, onshore wind in order to supply every country south of you that wants to produce green steel with sufficient energy? Do we need more interconnection capacity, more transmission capacity in Germany? What are the hindrances here?
Well, I'm happy that it gives me a chance for one of my Carthage sentences, if that's a historical reference that makes sense to you, because I've always come down when talking in a European context about reforming the German energy market, or at least the bidding zones within Germany. Because if we are to have any chance of ever sending any kind of power to Austria, there needs to be incentives all the way down Germany to grow that transmission network. And right now they are, of course, operating with one bidding zone. And the problem with that, it doesn't show the incentive of connecting areas. And Germany has found it very, very hard to establish those very, very necessary transmission lines. Of course, from a very short-term perspective, it's an advantage for Danish power producers that Germany doesn't have many bidding zones, because if they have many bidding zones, it would show that the top of Germany would have very low power prices, because that's where we deliver wind, and that's where Germany themselves have built their wind power. And as we move further and further down to the industrial south of Germany, we see that power prices rise all the way down. But that would, of course, give an incentive to start building transmission lines so we can transfer energy from the north, and actually also energy from the south, in terms of solar energy, that would meet somewhere in the middle around Austria and southern Germany and eastern France. So generally a good thing for the Europeans. So that actually is the main challenge in terms of the European power market. I would say that another side also, that CCS is actually part of the Danish climate plans. At the same time as we are implementing the tax on industry, there's been a relatively large fund for carbon capture. It's not pre-designated for industry, but at least we hope that our waste incinerators and our concrete producers, we don't have a very large concrete production, but we actually have one of Europe's largest concrete factories in Denmark, will be the source of CCS. And CCS itself isn't actually very power consumptive. It doesn't actually have a very high power consumption. Transferring steel production from one energy source to another energy source will, as you say, require quite a lot of kilowatt hours. But CCS itself isn't actually very power intensive. So establishing that, it's definitely part of our climate plans for those fossil production, or for those emitters that we find hard to transition to other power sources.
Thanks a lot. And now we are at almost a bit past our time, but I still want to take a few minutes. Was Simon, you had a comment? Perhaps you took your hand down. Maybe it's already dealt with. But I would like to ask you about because there were several questions from the audience on the climate adaptation. We haven't talked about it yet. So a little bit the solution that Sébastien fleshed out, so the French solution, there was a question, oh, well, but if you do that, wouldn't you shift the cost basically of taking high flood risks to those who don't take those flood risks? Of course, that's a little bit the essence of an insurance, but I was also wondering, wouldn't you, in a first step, also need more land planning that disallows building next in those flooding zones? So what would be the right mix in order to tackle this problem in your mind? Simon.
Okay, so I'll start, and then maybe Sébastien wants to come in as well. Let me start with a few words on steel production. First, I think the revamp of photovoltaic has been a massive success story in Austria in recent years. The per capita installation rates are like impressive and world leading, and that's also why, as Mark mentioned, we've changed from an importer to an exporter of electricity in recent data for about the last year or so. So the ramp up is impressive, and of course this needs to be ongoing to create the electricity we also need for the decarbonization of steel production. The picture is more challenging on wind, though, I would say. And of course the grid infrastructure also comes into play, because import capacities are limited, and that's the times when still gas-fired power plants kick in at certain times. I don't know if Thorsten is aware of, but formerly even Austria used to be in this common price zone with Germany. So it has been even bigger, and that change caused some challenges down here south. There's also a massive subsidy scheme for the decarbonization of industry, which has very recently been approved by the European Commission, state aid departments, and which I think is going to add on top of the transformation process already going on at this major steel manufacturing company in Austria. On carbon capture and storage, you may be aware of that recently the incumbent government recommended to Parliament to lift the ban on carbon storage, geological storage in Austria. A carbon management strategy was adopted recently, and I would expect this work to be ongoing, and a new government may also be working on the implementation of the EU CCS directive, which would be necessary. We also signed an MOU with Denmark recently, and have very good exchange with Denmark specifically on this subject. Just to briefly mention it here, and a few words on adaptation and flood risks. In the latest edition of our national adaptation strategy, the insurance issue is also mentioned. That new rules for mandatory insurance or an insurance-based model should be assessed and considered. I think as climate ministry we would be very much in favor of that. Currently, of course, you have an issue with adverse selection, because people tend to know, to some degree at least, if they're exposed to flood risks or not. And so I guess for an insurance-based model to work, you would have a need to broaden the base of insured people, and different legislative or subsidized approaches may be feasible to achieve this goal, facilitated by the government.
Thank you, Simon. And I really have to close now, but I want to do something unusual. I'm going to give Erwin Meyer the final word, because he was our most active participant. I think I've unmuted you, Mr. Meyer. You have comments on various things. Keep it short, please. Everybody wants to go for lunch.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, I had a lot of talks to the first Alpine in Austria the last 2 decades, and they would never go in the direction of CCS. They don't need it. They prefer plasma technologies and others. They use hydrogen as a reduction material. So they have a lot of demand for green electricity and green hydrogen, but they don't need CCS at all. The second thing is the polluter pays principle, because we had a flood in Lower Austria. I'm living there, and I had a flood in my area. It should not be paid by the victims, and not even be paid by the possible victims. So all those ideas circling around the persons who should pay for this insurance, to my mind, is a wrong idea. The polluter should pay for it. So we need higher carbon prices. Then at least we have the polluters of the present, and they should pay for directly compensating the victims. We have these big discussions on the COP level with loss and demand between industrialized countries and emerging countries and developing countries, but we don't have this discussion in the OECD countries. So high emitters should pay for the damage they are causing to the victims. We need a financial flow going from the emitters to the victims, and not have an insurance among the victims.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. And I'm not going to question, your perspective as an actual victim of the flood, but it's certainly something gives us food for thought. I want to release you also for real food, your lunch, but not without thanking you, Thorsten, Mark, Simon, Erwin Meyer, and Mr. Luger, And of course, Sebastian, who contributed to this inspiring discussion. It was great. I think we should do this each time, cross a perspective when we discuss a survey, cross the perspective with one other OECD member, because there's so much to learn when you have a one-on-one discussion. Thanks a lot and have a good day.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.